When we think of magicians giving powerful weapons to their proteges/companions, we tend not to think too much about the consequences said weapons will have on their users. At least, not as much as we focus on what they can do to their opponents. Even when you see a limiting weapon being provided to someone, you know that that limitation will only kick in at a certain moment, so you don't worry too much about it for the rest of your watch time. In the case of the Berserker armor, you are always reading a chapter at the edge of your seats because you literally never know when this thing could turn on its allies. Enemies be damned. Despite being a suit of armor, we are choosing to classify it as a weapon because, quite frankly, if you've read Berserk, you know what we're talking about. And if you haven't, you will in just a few moments because in this video, we're going to explain why the Berserker armor is the most dangerous weapon in anime history. Armors are usually a part of his daily attire, but regular armor can only get a man so far when fighting against inhumans. The need for the Berserker armor in the story. Have you guys ever noticed that Guts rarely, if ever, fights without his armor on? I mean, sure, you could argue that his Golden Age clothing scheme can hardly be called proper armor, and that during his Black Swordsman days, his armor was as essential to his existence as his skin, but our question still stands. We can only think of two instances where Guts was forced to fight without his armor, and the first one isn't even technically accurate. Also, just to clarify, when we talk about fights, we mean instances where Guts took down multiple opponents by himself, so one-on-one duels don't count. The first time we see Guts go into a proper battle with no armor on is during the eclipse. At the beginning of that infernal nocturnal feast, he's seen sporting a leather jerkin, but that is soon stripped away from him by the countless apostles that have gathered to participate in Griffith's ascension. He ends that fight topless, and down an eye and an arm. Had he had his proper gear from his Band of the Falcon days, things might have played out a little differently for him, but in his defense, he did just finish taking care of Wild before Griffith triggered the eclipse. The second time is shortly after the eclipse, when Guts wakes up after being out of commission for 4 days and suffers through his first night of terrors. When he ran out of that cave, sprinting through the rain trying to get rid of all the horrible memories burned into his now defunct right eye, the last thing he was expecting was an attack from ghosts. Thanks to his mad luck, or causality, whichever you prefer, Skull Knight shows up just in time to help him fend off the spirits and whisk him away to safety once again. Guts uses the Wandering Wraith's thorn-covered sword to great effect, but a more pressing concern causes him to leave the scene before he can make good on his declaration of war, namely Casca escaping the protective care that was going to be her new home. Once he becomes the Black Swordsman, you rarely see Guts without his armor, and that's frankly understandable given what he's going up against. He can't even catch a proper wink without an evil astral creature trying to jump him, so even thinking about taking the armor off for rest is out of the question. But what can he do when he ends up losing his armor to an opponent that isn't just far stronger than him, but can literally hurt both his body and soul? The answer is nothing, as we learned when Guts went up against Slan and Clipawk. At first, the Black Swordsman relished her advent because it had been a while since he had let loose, and his inner bloodlust had been held back for far too long. But it became clear rather quickly that any blows Guts might land on Slan would be because she would allow it to happen. The God Hand member used Troll Guts to give herself a temporary physical form, yet even then her power was so massive that she easily restrained Guts and stripped him of his armor. She then slashed him across the chest, giving him a wound that attacked both his physical and astral body. Though Guts was able to fire off a point-blank cannonball at her guts and then run her through with Dragon Slayer, Slan proved to be far more durable than him as she simply disintegrated back into the astral world, leaving the domain of her advent in a mire of chaos. Although Guts was able to survive that dimension collapse thanks to Skull Knight's dimension-splitting sword of actuation, which you can learn more about from our video on it, just go check out our channel, he wasn't quite okay in its aftermath. A wound to the astral body doesn't heal like a physical wound does. No amount of elf dust could close up a gash through your literal soul. Only time could. And if Guts were to strain himself, the physical wounds would just reopen, making his situation worse. Shirke was amazed he could even walk on his own 2 feet. But despite being one of Berserk's strongest witches, even she couldn't have foreseen that Guts bleeding all over the shop as he fights inhuman monsters was ultimately inevitable. That's because no one saw the Apostle attack at Flora's Spirit Tree Mansion coming. And if you said you did, we know where to find a liar now. Usually he fights against Apostles. He has all his gear and no chest-splitting astral wounds on his friggin' soul to deal with, so this fight was already gonna be tough for him. But To make matters worse, Guts ended up being challenged by who was quite possibly Griffith's most physically powerful apostle, the Flame Dragon Knight Grunbeld. Against the hulking behemoth, all Guts could do was block, and he realized that if he didn't get armor on him soon, he was just as good as dead. Grunbeld was making short work of him, and if Guts kept blocking, he soon wouldn't have hands to swing his sword or block anyone's attacks with. It is at this most desperate hour that Guts receives the armor that has since become an iconic part of his design, but more importantly, his very personality itself. As he braced himself for another blow from Grunbeld, Guts was telepathically contacted by Shirke, who told him she had something for him, a suit of armor that could help him defeat the Flame Dragon Knight with ease. But she didn't have enough time to explain the drawbacks of using said armor, and even if she did, we doubt Guts would have had the patience to listen to her anyway. He had been battered to within an inch of his life, and Shirke told her companions to just put him in the armor anyways, as it would take care of the wounds. But what she said and what happened are day and night in comparison, though she wasn't technically wrong in saying that the armor would take care of things. As soon as Guts put the Berserker armor on, you could see a change in the air. And not for the better. As his party was putting the armor's pieces onto his body, an apostle broke into where Guts was hiding and ended up swallowing him whole. Visor, gauntlets, greaves, and all. The apostle walked out claiming that he ate Guts, but that for some reason, it hurts. That reason would turn out to be Guts turning the apostle's insides into shish kebab, because somehow, despite being clamped down on by teeth strong enough to uproot a tree, Guts was perfectly fine. In fact, he was better than that because he turned the apostle into diced meat from inside his gut, when he was barely able to lift Dragonslayer a few moments ago. Even Grunbeld is taken aback by this sudden power surge, questioning whether this man he faced now was the same black swordsman or not, and in a way, his questioning was justified. That's because this man in front of him wasn't Guts anymore. It was his inner beast of darkness running rampant, thanks to the Berserker armor. It's so dangerous that even Skull Knight doesn't want to come out at first, but even he can't deny its urgent need. We were warned about the dangerous nature of the Berserker armor well before Guts ever put it on, but looking at it in isolation, it doesn't really convey the sheer horror that its user's body has to endure while they're inside of it. In Chapter 222, we learn that the reason for Skull Knight's visit to Flora wasn't just so that he could help Guts and Co. out and clip off, he was there to ask a favor as well. We learned that the favor was to draw one of her signature talismans on the breastplate of what appeared to be just an ordinary piece of armor at the time. Flora's age showed through the job though, as she claims that making this single talisman had already drained her. But we would soon learn that that's only half true. She starts reminiscing about the piece of armor as she addresses Skull Knight, calling it nostalgic. But the Wandering Wraith moves to remind her just how perilous this object truly was. Flora quietly reprimands him for thinking she's just some senile old witch by reminding him that she was the one who had watched over the armor for so long, and given the fact that she'd also probably seen SK use it back in his Geiseric days, his question was frankly quite asinine. However, she then states that the danger the armor presents was precisely why Guts needed it. It was basically a miracle that he'd been surviving these apostle fights without losing his life, let alone another limb. Though Flora didn't make that connection herself, it was easy to see where she was going with her words. Skull Knight calls the armor coming back into play a karmic event, but Flora rejects that statement and says karma is a spiral, not a circle, and that Guts and Co. were not destined to make the same choices as her and Skull Knight. The Wandering Wraith resigns himself to this explanation from his old friend before heading off to fight Griffith's apostles who had come for Flora, just so she could experience peace in her final moments. While Guts took on Grunbeld, Skull Knight went for his usual dancing partner, the immortal one, Nosferatu Zod. The two fierce warriors clashed with one another for the second time in the series itself, and Zod was so excited to have at Skull Knight that he killed one of his minions who tried to interfere in their battle. The only thing that distracted him from his eternal rival was the arrival of a man clad in a suit of armor that only Zod could recognize out of every apostle gathered for the mission. When he sees Guts clad in the Berserker armor, he lets out a reminiscent sigh and asks Skull Knight if he intends for Guts to follow the same path he took to hell. But the Wandering Wraith remains silent. We don't immediately understand the reason behind Zod's statement or Skull Knight's silence, but stick around till the end of the video and you guys will find out. The two rivals put their fight on hold, as they have done before, to bear witness to the battle potential of a man they both recognized was a beast with the sword. Guts had already earned Zod's respect when they fought the first time, even though he technically won only because the Immortal One spared him. In their second proper encounter, Guts was not only able to keep up with Zod, but he actually started overpowering him in his base form, a development that delighted the Immortal One to no end. However, all of this progress had been made through Guts' sheer human tenacity. At the time of their first encounter, he was the fearless raider captain of the Band of the Falcon, and one of the strongest humans in the entire world. If anyone from the band was going to be able to stand up to Zod, it was him, and that perception only intensified after his time as the Black Swordsman. Killing dozens upon dozens of apostles without proper rest or shelter had honed Guts into a swordsman without peer. The warrior within Zod was extremely pleased with that, but with the Berserker armor on, Guts could finally realize his true potential as a fighter, because now his limitations had been unleashed. It turns you into an unstoppable warrior immune to pain, but the toll it extracts is far too much. The Berserker armor's introduction and how it works. We've already told you guys why Guts needed the Berserker armor and what happened immediately after he donned it, but we don't think we were able to quite impress upon you just how lethal everything Guts does becomes with the Berserker armor on, not just for his enemies, but for his allies and even himself. When Guts emerges from the, guts of the Apostle he turned into the aforementioned platter of diced meat, Isidro starts fanboying like crazy because, as he rightly points out, Strong doesn't even begin to cover what Guts just did. He starts chastising Shirke for keeping such an insane power-up hidden from them all this while, especially when they nearly got stuck in Clip-Off fighting trolls. But she tells him that things aren't as simple as he thinks they are. Grunbeld can't recognize Guts at first because his movements are so drastically different from what they were mere moments ago, and it's only the Dragon Slayer in Guts' hand that confirms his identity for the Flame Dragon Knight. If you guys were paying attention to that last sentence I spoke, then you'd have already noticed what was really off-putting about the armor already. Usually, Guts uses both of his hands to wield Dragon Slayer because otherwise he just wouldn't have the grip he needed to fend off multiple targets coming at him from different directions. This is also because of a design flaw, because the Dragon Slayer is simply too massive to be wielded like a normal sword. Most men had been unable to even lift it, with Guts' wielding of the blade shocking even its creator, Godot. But no matter how much you push yourself physically, it will still be impossible for you to wield this sword freely with a single hand. Yet now, with the Berserker armor on, Guts was holding it like a longsword ready to strike at any moment. And that's all because of the armor's nature. The Berserker armor has two key features, both of which sound good on paper, but are extremely harmful to its user, especially in the long run. The primary feature of the Berserker armor is that it completely inhibits the wearer's sense of pain. No, not the kind of pain that's resolved by journaling, we're talking about the physical sensation of pain. The dictionary definition of the term is an extremely uncomfortable physical sensation that stems from an illness or an injury. Pain is how we gauge our body's physical limitations. It's the sensation that lets us know when something is seriously wrong with us, and when it goes away, it's usually a sign that an issue has been resolved. Pain, to put it plainly, is a barometer that keeps the human body functional by letting it know when it's overstepping its boundaries in one way or another. This is why when you're at the gym and one of your sets makes you feel like you're in far more physical discomfort than usual, chances are you've just pulled something and your body is letting you know you should stop and treat it first. Now imagine if the sensation itself was taken away from you. Sounds great, right? Well, it only sounds great, but in practice, it would be a waking nightmare. Remember that James Bond villain from The World Is Not Enough? His entire reason for being a villain is that he didn't feel anything. Now, while it is true that the Berserker armor only bestows this ability to the users for the time that they are wearing it, a user can do irreparable damage to themselves by the time they decide to take it off. Because the elimination of pain also eliminates the natural limitations our bodies place on us so that we don't end up injuring ourselves whilst performing physical activities. Humans can't jump as high as marsupials, they can't move as quickly as gazelles, and they certainly cannot tank a full force blow from a dragon tail that is made out of the third hardest element in existence. Yet the Berserker armor allows Guts to do all of these things by simply cutting off his pain receptors and unleashing his maximum physical potential as a human being. We see Guts bashing directly into Grunbeld's shield multiple times, executing honest-to-God anime somersaults through the air as he did so as well. But the coolness of this act was overshadowed by its toll on Guts' body. Though he had surpassed the movement capability and pain threshold of any average person before him, Shirke tells the impressed Isidro and concerned Serpico that his newfound strength was nothing to be cheered. She tells them, and by extension us, that the Berserker armor is a magical fetish made by the dwarves. He who dons the armor and aligns with the ominous ode imbued within it is driven by such violent emotions that things like pain and fear do not matter to them anymore. We've already told you why that's not a good thing, and then we see it with our eyes as well. After executing a brutal flurry of strikes at Grunbeld, smashing through his shield and blowing up his arm cannon with a cannon shot of his own, Guts takes a step back and rises to acknowledge his handiwork. Suddenly, the armor closes hard around his body and we see blood dripping out of every crevice within it. Though Guts was performing beyond peak level thanks to the armor, it was doing nothing to soften the blows he was eating, nor was it protecting him from his own limit-breaking body movement. This is why we called the Berserker armor more a weapon than a traditional set of armor in the beginning of this video, because it increases all of your offensive abilities while simply negating the concept of defense by nullifying pain. It does protect Guts from his enemies' attacks better than most regular armor, as nothing Grunbeld does puts a proper dent on it, when a regular armor would have caved at his first strike in his release state. But that's nothing compared to the damage it itself inflicts upon Guts. When he eats a corundum-crusted tail whip at near point-blank range, Guts is able to stand up and continue fighting where he'd become history had he met it with no armor on, but the sheer force and impact of the blow breaks both his left arm and left leg, twisting them at disgusting angles. Isidro is horrified by this, but his terror was only just beginning, because then, the Berserker armor takes over and forcibly rearranges Guts' limbs by riddling his body with metal spikes. This happens every time Guts experiences a near-lethal blow within the Berserker armor. The armor itself is designed to keep its user fighting by any means necessary. Bent limbs get pierced and put back into place. Chest cavities are covered up by its spikes that force things into such a position that it becomes irrelevant to even think of the gaping hole in your literal torso. Because you feel no pain, you won't even understand the severity of your injuries until after you've taken the armor off, and there might be no time to do that in the first place given how quickly it consumes its user's psyche. This is tied into the second primary feature of the Berserker armor, which is that it negates all other emotions whilst amplifying the worst ones within your psyche: rage, hatred, violence. This is the unholy trinity of emotions that the Berserker armor focuses on, and once it has you in its grip, it's quite difficult to get you out of it. This piece of dwarven craftsmanship has been imbued with a rather specific type of ode, which induces these emotions. Ode in the world of Berserk basically refers to a creature's spiritual life force, and it can usually be manipulated by powerful mages or magical artifacts. Shirke uses ode manipulation to draw off the soldiers harassing her in Britannis, for example, but that's a very mild occurrence when you compare it to what the Berserker armor does. By amping up that trinity of emotions, it exposes its user to their own inner malice, and if they're not mindful of it at all times, they are very susceptible to falling prey to it. The moment Guts puts on the Berserker armor, the first thing he notices is the pain negation, but the second thing is a burning impulse that rises through him. He hears a faint voice asking him to yield himself to it within his mind, and then we get a full-page spread of Guts' inner beast of darkness, which is essentially an amalgamation of all the worst things that Guts is capable of doing with his hands. If you guys don't know about the Beast of Darkness, we'd recommend you check out its origins video on our channels, but what it basically comes down to is this: putting Guts, with his inner malevolence simmering just underneath the surface, inside an apparatus that lets said malevolence loose, is the worst idea anyone could have come up with. As he fights Grunbeld, it becomes clearer that he isn't exactly fighting his enemies as much as he's butchering everything in his sight. Everyone is sickened by his brutish fighting style, but Serpico is the one who realizes what it truly means for all of them. He makes the connection between the name of the armor and the Berserkers of legend, and is the first one to warn the group that if Guts stays in Berserk mode for too long, things might get hairy for them. And, sure enough, when Guts sees his party in his Berserker state, his first thoughts are to kill them. If it hadn't been for the talisman Flora had applied to the armor's breastplate, which kept Guts' own ego from collapsing within the armor, and Shirkei's impulse decision to project herself into it astrally in order to try and save Guts, perhaps none of the Black Swordsman party would have survived that day. And to make matters even worse, as if they weren't bad enough already, this astral projection solution starts losing effectiveness after the first try. Shirkei thinks that she's the one who's helping Guts come back to his senses, but in truth, it's the Moonlight Boy, Guts' son whose body was fused into Griffith's vessel that has prevented his rampages since that first go-around with the Berserker armor. Shirkei is only able to break through to him when the Moonlight Boy softens him up for her, and she doesn't know this yet. That first time, she was able to locate Guts' ego within his consciousness thanks to her mistress's talisman. That talisman has presumably been exhausted, however, making Guts even more vulnerable to losing himself if he isn't already relying on Shirkei to keep him sane. And to round things out, the physical effects of the Berserker armor on Guts' body are beyond anything you can dream of in your wildest dreams. Overall, he must have had the Berserker armor on for about 5 minutes, 10 tops the first time he uses it, yet it immediately turns a patch of his hair white from the strain it puts on him, and with every subsequent use, Guts starts losing both body mass and physical sensation. He becomes skinnier each time he removes the Berserker armor to fully heal, and all of his 5 senses get duller with each subsequent use. At first, Guts only had momentary lapses in vision, light tremors in his fingers, and a slight change in his taste buds. But by the time he reaches Elfhelm, his vision is pretty much cataract-like, and his hands are so out of whack that he has to bandage Dragonslayer to his palm to even move it correctly. Going through even one of these nervous system issues is bad enough for a regular human being, let alone all of them simultaneously. Yet that is the power of the Berserker armor. It takes more from you than it gives to you, and to put the crimson cherry on top of this bleeding cake, Guts isn't even using the armor to its full potential. What is the history of the Berserker armor? Is there any way to keep it at bay and even control its power? How does it impact the future of Berserk itself? Though we'd been told that Skull Knight was the last user of the Berserker armor, it didn't quite sink in for us until Guts' party finally reached Elfhelm. On this paradise-like island, the flowers were always in bloom, the birds were always chirping, the baked goods were always delicious, and, oh yes, the entire island is key to understanding the history of Kentaro Miura's masterpiece. Before his passing, Miura would often refer to Berserk as a 1,000-year story. It began with the reign of the enigmatic Supreme King Geiserik, who forged the only continent-wide empire known to mankind, and is seemingly going to conclude with Guts finally getting his revenge on Griffith and the God Hand by extension. It only makes sense that fate would not be the only link between the two strugglers of the story, because before Guts ever used it, the Berserker armor was likely what gained Geiserik his massive empire. In chapters 361 and 362, we get a lot of subtle exposition regarding the events that might have unfolded around the time the first eclipse took place. We learned that the Berserker armor was created before King Geiserik took over. The way that the histories and fables talk about his sudden and absolute rise to power, and some of his epithets like the Skull King and the King of Galloping Death, suggests that he used the armor in some capacity to rise through the ranks. He must have either conquered Elfhelm sometime during his campaign, or originated from Skellig Island because he intimately knows at least one of its inhabitants. The interaction between Skull Knight and Great Guru Gedfring is not one of strangers or even acquaintances. These guys knew each other back when Skull Knight was still a human. Gedfring implies just as much when he says he used to attend many of the former king's audiences with his father Vid, and Skull Knight immediately recognizes Vid's name as someone he used to know. The creator of the armor that currently hosts his dead soul, Hanar, is also the same man who made the Berserker armor. When Guts goes to visit Hanar with Skull Knight and Gedfring, he learns that despite all the control he'd developed over the Berserker armor across his journeys, he still wasn't using the armor to its full potential. See, in order to use the Berserker armor and not accidentally kill his friends at the same time, Guts either needs to draw out the armor's bare minimum power, which allows him to dull the pain and work through his injuries, or rely on Shirkei, whose presence allows him to draw out more of the armor's power without losing his mind to it. Typically, Shirkei needs to be touching Guts for this method to work, and even then there's no guarantee that his Beast of Darkness wouldn't take over, but it's certainly better than letting Guts fight all by himself. Guts had thought that the armor was helping him stay alive because of his mastery over it, but when Hanar told him he hadn't been using it properly, his eyes widened with quiet disbelief. And then, Guts was shown what would end up happening to him if he kept using the magical fetish in the way that he was. When the Black Swordsman arrived with his trademark drip at the Stone Forest of Dwarves, Hanar was extremely uncomfortable at having been reunited with a creation he probably wished never existed in the first place. Guts thanks the man for his masterwork, but Hanar tells him he's being hasty, and besides, that armor was more likely to consume him just for the sake of it rather than help him. He strikes the Berserker armor with his blacksmith's hammer, and it immediately activates the fetish, which then shows Guts a blood memory, namely, the final moments of Skull Knight's human life. The flashback shows a desolate land covered in monstrous tentacles with the abyss lurking in the background and creepy apostle-like creatures popping up in the foreground. Skull Knight slashes through the ladder as he makes his way towards the abyssal hole, but we instantly realize that he's too late. We then see a few things in quick succession. A brand of sacrifice spreading across the tentacle floor, just like it did during Griffith's incarnation, a woman that looks like Flower Storm Monarch Danon dying in Skull Knight's arms, and 5 demonic creatures that are likely a version of the God Hand, with the only recognizable figure amongst them being Void. The flashback then ends, which implies that Geiserik probably died fighting the rest of the Hellspawn that came out of the eclipse. And if you take that along with the statement Hanar made about the armor's nature, a grim picture starts to emerge. After this history lesson about the last time the Berserker armor was used, which also explains its skull-shaped helmet before Guts took ownership of it, Elfhelm was hit with a surprise attack by Griffith and his apostles. Guts confronted his mortal enemy, keeping the Berserker armor restrained and using only his personal will to try and hack Griffith into pieces, but it was to no avail. Griffith simply used his godlike spatial abilities to deflect every sword swing of Guts's effortlessly, and then kidnaps Casca and takes her back to Falconia. Guts, who had been walking on his feet with his grip held tight around Dragonslayer for so long out of sheer tenacity, crumbled when that happened. He broke down emotionally and had to be carried to Roderick's seahorse before Elfhelm completely disappeared off the face of the earth. Once there, instead of talking to his comrades, Guts isolated himself and had a near psychotic break. He thinks to himself that throughout all of his struggles, from childhood to adulthood, the only thing that hadn't failed him was his sword. But even that was now useless against Griffith. As he despairs at his many losses, Guts is taunted by his Beast of Darkness, who urges him to reach out for more power at what is quite possibly the most unstable we've ever seen Guts. The guy has refused to talk to anyone, pushed away Shirkei's astral body, and is currently wearing the most dangerous weapon to be ever created in anime history. Chapter 373, the latest chapter of Berserk, ends on a cliffhanger where we see the Kushan slavers board the seahorse, and 3 of them come across a seemingly unconscious Guts who has finally managed to grab hold of his sword. If you pay very close attention to the final panel of that chapter, it looks like the Berserker armor's helmet is creeping up towards Guts' head, which is bad news for everyone on board because this time there's no guarantee that any of the failsafes they've developed will work if Guts goes berserk. He is at his lowest mental, physical, and emotional point. If he embraces his malice now and gives into the armor, he will most likely end up just like Skull Knight, trotting about in a rattling coffin for a millennium looking to defeat his undefeatable opponents somehow. But as Flora told Skull Knight, karma is a spiral, and there's no guarantee that Guts and his companions will go through the same fate as Flora and Skull Knight. In the end, Berserk is a story that's all about persevering through the unimaginable. Guts was fighting inhuman apostles long before he got magic armor, and we imagine he'd have continued doing so even if he did not have the Berserker armor. But now that he does, it's become a double-edged sword that can decimate not only those he hates, but those he loves as well. What will be intriguing is to see what role it plays in the final encounter between Guts and Griffith, because we've already seen that Guts cannot beat the Falcon of Light with just his own strength. He's going to need some kind of astral nuclear warhead to take out the God Hand members, and maybe, just maybe, that's where the Berserker armor's true purpose lies. If Guts ends up failing to defeat Griffith for whatever reason, then he will most certainly end up like Skull Knight, and then he can kiss the entire reason for his existence goodbye. His words, not ours. Marvelous verdict! But sadly, that's where we're going to have to end this video. In the beginning, we mentioned that witches and wizards giving their proteges or protagonists magical weapons with no consequences is a common occurrence. But that's not the case in Berserk. Power demands sacrifice in this way, and oftentimes that sacrifice is giving up all those aspects that make you a human. The Berserker armor is one such object of power. It gives its wearer every possible battle advantage they can think of when they're in it, but then hits them like a dozen freight trains with its severely draining after effects. It focuses so much on offense that it can't even be truly called protective gear, and that's why it's one of the most dangerous weapons in anime history. But what do you guys think about the Berserker armor? Let us know in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, fellow strugglers.